everyone that comes to Elevation sees the pipe and drape and how we seat a room and how, creating an atmosphere is important. But there's a story behind kind of how the way we seat rooms came to be. Can you tell us that story a little bit?
Yeah, I think my obsession with room dynamics and atmosphere and seating is actually a reaction against all of the bad room dynamics and seating and atmospheres that I experienced for years before we started the church. When you travel in ministry, you get thrown in all kinds of situations. So you may go in to preach in a room where they were expecting 120 people, 20 people showed up, they let them sit wherever they want. And then it's like, hey, here's our guest speaker. You don't know the people, you weren't in charge of the worship music, the room smells bad, the atmosphere that was created before you was either too long or too short. And in that process, I made commitments within myself about when I have the opportunity to make decisions about these things, I will create the best atmospheres that anybody has ever experienced for worship. Yes. And it wasn't just out of a frustration about me as a preacher having to have a good atmosphere to preach to. It was out of a belief of what happens when 2 or 3 are gathered in His name, or when we assemble together for worship, that we owe the message that we claim to represent the best presentation and the most conducive atmosphere we can create. Yes. And so I came home from one youth event that was somewhere in some godforsaken state somewhere in the country, and I won't mention it because probably somebody is from there. But I was in this small town, big auditorium, small crowd, people sitting everywhere, about 50 people in a room that's seated, I'm going to guess conservatively 1,500. And nobody had told them where to sit, so they were sitting everywhere. When I went up to preach, I had to find a music stand because nobody had found, obviously, it's not worth thinking of that kind of stuff ahead of time. Where's the preacher going to put his Bible? God forbid we'd think about that. So I'm finding a music stand and I'm like, hey, can everybody move closer? Would it be all right? And the guy goes, no, they're fine where they are. So I was like, okay. And so I preached my little, 25-minute message. I cut it short because it was just so awful. And I came home and we were in the planning stages of the church. So I was phasing out of traveling youth ministry, phasing into the church. And I remember I met with the staff at that time, which is funny to call them that because usually that denotes payment or reciprocation or benefits. But for us, that just meant you work as hard as if you did get paid, but you don't. And so I called them together. I was like, I need you to know something. We are going to do something revolutionary. We are going to find a curtain apparatus. And I don't know where we're going to find this. I don't know if we're going to have to make them, but we're going to have curtain apparati in every room that we ever seat, whether it's 20 people or 20,000. All of our rooms are always going to feel packed. I want it to feel energetic. I don't want to eat at the restaurant that nobody else is in the parking lot when I drive by. If nobody else is eating there and it's 12:30 and you serve lunch, something's wrong. So I don't want to create that church either. So I want people, when they come in, I want them to feel excited. I want it to feel intentional. I want it to feel expectant. I don't want to manipulate people's emotions as much as I want to prepare an atmosphere for God to work within people's emotions. Right. And I want to use the senses that God has given people to experience who He is. If God didn't care about atmosphere, why is the book of Leviticus so long about how that temple needs to be designed? Why are there so many chapters in Exodus about what kind of incense I'm supposed to burn and how many cubits the entryway is supposed to be? If God doesn't care about atmosphere. And so I think that just like in the Old Testament, they built a temple, tabernacle and temple for God, we get to build that with the worship that we create. God dwells in the praises of His people. He inhabits the praises of His people. And so part of that is establishing an atmosphere that's worthy of a king. And so we talked about the curtain apparatus and the seating flow and everything like that. And we found out that they made this stuff called pipe and drape. And I went to this church planter who had promised to give me some money. And I said, I need about $2,000 to buy a curtain apparatus. And I didn't know it was called pipe and drape at this point, so I sounded like an idiot. And he said, we'll buy you some pipe and drape. And they gave us the money, we bought the pipe and drape. And since then, we have been absolutely ruthless about the way that the rooms feel at Elevation Church. If I'm preaching and I look out and I see empty seats, I want to know who was in charge of those ushers. If I look out in the room and I see staggered seating that doesn't make sense, I want to know who was in charge of that. Not because I think that God is limited to the atmosphere we can create, but because I think that God is honored by the level of excellence and attention that we bring to something that we say we're offering to Him. And I don't know why we think we have to dismiss one for the other. Can God move in a bad atmosphere? Of course. He moved in prisons. When the apostles were preaching the gospel at first, some of their best sermons were in stocks when they were beat and torn to shreds. God can move anywhere He wants to, at any time that He wants to. But, you know, God is great and greatly to be praised. Right. And so just because God can move even in a prison doesn't mean that we need to make our worship experience feel like a prison or a detention center to prove that He's more powerful than that. And so it's funny to me how some people will build immaculate homes and pay attention to everything about the decor of their home and the finishes in their home. But we call the church God's house, that we're God's house. Yeah. We're the house of God. So why wouldn't I want the temperature in the room to be just right when people are meeting with God? Yes. Why would I put more effort into the way I build my house than I would in the way I build God's house? Right. One time God got frustrated with His people. He said, is now a time for you to be living in fine paneled palaces built with human hands when the house of the Lord lies in ruins? And so why would I give my best attention? Why would I give my best effort to building anything other than the church? Why wouldn't businessmen be coming to Elevation Church saying, we need the same culture and flow and vibe and excellence that you have in your church in our business? Right. Shouldn't we be leading the way? Doesn't always mean spending money, but it means intentionality. Right. And we need more and more people understanding the principle of atmosphere. Because sometimes we'll come in and blame something on a spiritual factor that was really a practical thing. Right. Oh man, the energy was off today. That crowd was dead. Those people really didn't want to worship. No. The room was about 87 degrees. The sound was way off. All you could hear was crash cymbals. Couldn't hear any vocals. The lyrics were about 2 things behind every time they came up on the screen, so the people didn't know the words to sing. It was seated so sloppily that there was this packed section over here and an empty section over here, and there was no energy to the room. So let's don't blame God for stuff that we can fix by doing a little more work. Yeah. And if we really value the presence of God, and if we value people, then we're going to want to prepare for when they show up. I said before that the level of honor that you give to a guest can be determined by the amount of preparation that you put into their arrival. Now, if we say that people far from God are what matters the most to us, then we'll prepare for their arrival. If we say that God matters the most to us, then we'll prepare for His arrival in our worship experiences. And so I'm looking for more people who would find it unacceptable to walk by a piece of trash, who would find it unacceptable to walk by a sloppy area, because we realize that what we say in the little things says big things about what we believe about God. Right. That the way we approach the little details isn't a little thing at all. And again, I would point you back to the fact that in the Bible, God was very specific about everything that He ever wanted built for Himself. There was never a, well, it's good enough for God mentality. No, the house of the Lord had to be exceedingly magnificent. Right. And nothing has changed today. We've got to do it to the best of our ability so that then God can do things that He can only do in His supernatural ability.